Hi, today we're going to take a look at, what elements of Star Trek maybe could be adapted for Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I should say right at the beginning, this isn't an attempt to sell you on doing D&D in space like Spelljammer or Starfinder, although I'm sure those are fine games. But rather, it's something a little bit different. It's a way to say, are there some elements of this particular genre and this type of storytelling that could be adapted to make Dungeons and Dragons maybe a little more varied? This is really just a chance for me to brainstorm, and if you come up with some ideas that I missed, certainly put them in the comments. So let me give you some background on why I made this video. I've been running Dungeons & Dragons every Thursday for over a decade, and I really worry about getting stale, both for me and for my players. Now, I want to run RPGs as long as I can. I really do. I want to help people tell stories together, as long as I'm physically able to. But if I'm going to do that, I'm going to need new ideas every so often. I'm going to need to bring more than just the hack and slash to the table. So in this video, I thought, well, we'll take a look at the Star Trek genre. And if you like this video, and I get a few likes, maybe I'll do one on superheroes or Star Wars and how some of those tropes and elements, maybe could be used to enrich a D&D game. So I think it's just one of those things. It never hurts to look a little bit beyond our normal, usual resources. So let's get going here. And of course, the thing that stands out in anybody's mind for Star Trek is Starfleet. So in Star Trek, the characters are members of the United Federation of Planets, and they're sort of scientific military arm of Starfleet. Now that's very, very different than Dungeons and Dragons, where most of the time characters are kind of just a loose grouping and not even really sure how they're organized, or they just kind of adventure together. However, the idea of a federation or a Starfleet of sorts might actually work really nicely for Dungeons and Dragons. In terms of a federation, rather than a group of planets, it could be a group of nations banded together. Maybe they need to protect themselves against greater evils like dragon kingdoms or kingdoms ruled by evil wizards. And I think it makes a lot of sense because it gives a really good reason for why the dwarves and the elves and the humans and the warforged are all working together. And so these nations, this federation of sorts, may have an organization that sends out these exploratory teams that, maybe they seek out magic items and they try to protect different villages. And I know that there have been these kind of organizations in Dungeons and Dragons. I think they're in the Forgotten Realms. I believe there's the Harpers, although I'm not overly familiar with that. And if they're a member of a grouping, this is really good because it gives them missions or hooks for their adventures. Maybe the organization helps out with their expenses, so you don't have to worry about the day-to-day stuff of the money. And it also sort of gives them the theme of working towards the common good. Now, rather than operate out of a starship, they may work out of a town, and they have like a liaison in the town or a commanding officer who sends them out into the wilderness to take on certain jobs. However, if you want to make it more of a traveling setting, you absolutely could have them aboard a sailing ship and they go to different islands or continents, a sky ship if you want to do something like that, or Spelljammer. So you could talk with your players whether they would like something like that, where they're working for an organization. Or even better yet, you could just kind of write an NPC into your campaign and have them make the offer. Hey, would you be interested in joining this organization? And we work for the greater good and we try to protect the kingdoms. It's kind of like Captain Pike did in the rebooted Star Trek movie when he talked to Chris Pine and tried to talk him into joining Starfleet. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at that's really, really a common trope in really any TV show, but especially in Star Trek, is guest stars. In fact, guest stars are so important that we often, even when we talk about the different Star Trek episodes, we say, oh, it's the one with Apollo, or it's the one with Charlie X, or it's the one with Trelane. We even just talk about them that way because the guest stars are so important. So it's just something to think about. Rather than only doing dungeon adventures, maybe the PCs are asked to protect an important NPC who needs to travel between towns or cities. They could be sent out on a rescue mission to return a PC or an NPC rather to the town. Now, in that case, one thing that you might want to do is have the rescue occur very early in the game. And that sounds like, well, it should be the end. Yeah, but if we have it happen early, then you have the NPC around to, to play along with them on the journey home. I think just like Star Trek, the best ones, like I'm saying, like Trelane or Elan of Troyes, who was a take on Helen of Troy, is just try not to make them bland. And I need to remember this too. I'm not preaching to anybody. I need to always think about this too. Make them a little haughty or make them a little reckless if they want to rush into danger. Maybe they're scared and they run away, every time there's a possibility of danger and the PCs have to go find them. Now, here's another way that a guest star really, really works for Dungeons & Dragons. The guest star can be a great backup PC in case somebody dies or is paralyzed or turned to stone or something like that during a Dungeons & Dragons session. So, in fact, I've even used this where I've had some guest stars or people that they've rescued and then they get struck with feeble mind. Well, then they don't have to get sidelined. I can just tell the player, well, why don't you run this, the guest star, basically, the NPC for right now, at least till the end of the session. They don't have to play it forever, but it's certainly better than just sitting there watching other people play the game. Okay, now another thing that's unique in Star Trek, or in really, like I said, any TV show, is their recurring villains. Star Trek is known for very intelligent and interesting villains. They're not just bags of hit points. They have cultures, they have ideals of their own, even if sometimes they don't mind trampling on other cultures and other freedoms. Well, could we bring the idea of recurring villains into Dungeons & Dragons? And let's take a look at the Klingons. I could easily see a nation of tieflings or satyrs, I think of them because they kind of have the goatee beard, taking on the role of the Klingons. No problem. And you might even want to have the stipulation. Maybe there's an uneasy truce between the Federation and this the new group that's kind of representing the Klingons. So maybe, the player groups can't just kill them at sight and act like a murder hobo. Maybe they can keep the villains alive. Maybe they even can bring them back for questioning. So I think that's a good idea. That's one way to do that. And the other recurring villains we saw in several of the Star Trek series were the Romulans. I think they're actually a very easy thing to port into Dungeons & Dragons because you have the Drow or some other elven race. The Romulans look like the Vulcans. The Drow look like the Elves. The Romulans were very bent on conquest. But it would be really easy for a Drow to disguise themselves as elves and come in as spies. The Romulans they had their, I think it was the Tal Shiar spy network. So you could easily use both these Klingon and Romulan kind of analogs and still sort of get that Star Trek feeling. And you might say, well, then they're provoking a war every time there's a battle. Yeah, but the Klingons and the Romulans, they're not dumb. If they're going to have a group out in the wilderness, they may claim they're renegades or they're bandits or pirates. So even if you attack them, that wouldn't be a case of leading to war. Now, I think one of the things to think about with Star Trek is it had a certain moral ethos and a certain spirit that really could be brought to a Dungeons & Dragons game. And it may feel a little different initially. But think about Star Trek was very much about exploration and first contact. So maybe your adventuring party is contacting a reclusive village of gnomes or pixies or tabaxis. There's so many different races in Dungeons & Dragons, especially as time has gone on and they've added more and more. So easily they could be visiting these villages, trying to convince them, maybe you want to join this federation and help us out and we can help you out. And maybe they can help out the villages. Maybe there's goblins attacking the villages and they can show that the Federation or Federated Nations are on the side of good. Now, a version of the Prime Directive. In Star Trek, the idea of the Prime Directive was that you don't interfere with the development of the different cultures. So for a Dungeons & Dragons setting, it might be a case of maybe you don't reveal too much magic to different cultures or villages if they're not familiar with it initially. If they're not experienced with it, maybe you're kind of supposed to keep it kind of quiet while you're there. Now, a thing that I think also to think about with the Star Trek ethos is that there should still be combat. If it's not combat, at least some of the time, it doesn't really going to feel much like Dungeons & Dragons. But perhaps it could be a case of you give the opponents a chance to run away, or they might surrender and be taken prisoner. So it's not as much of, that you go in and you murder every goblin in the cave. Maybe the prisoners have information that the players need or want. Now, sometimes it will be necessary maybe to fight the monster to the death. Maybe it's a dragon or an evil creature from some lower plane. But I think in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, might be interesting to run a game where, every fight isn't a hack and slash all the way to the death. And another thing for Star Trek that maybe is a little different than Dungeons and Dragons is if you're working for an organization, the Starfleet analog that we're going to be thinking about here, you want to make sure that you're a really good representative of this Federation. So even a thief or a rogue character, might be able to use this as a chance to grow and use their skills for noble causes. So that might be one thing to think about in terms of Dungeons and Dragons. So will you use all these ideas in every campaign? Of course not. Is it going to work for every player or every group? No, but really nothing does, let's be honest. And I should say, in wrapping things up here, these are my ideas only. If you liked something I said today, adapt it, change it, use it the way you want. If you have another idea, let us know in the comments below. I really wanted to approach this video just as a chance to sort of think out loud together. And I'd like to do some other ones, like I said, bring them in maybe some other genres. So, if you liked the video, think about subscribing. Maybe you could give us a thumbs up down below. That's great. And there's links below if you'd like to check out some of our Sharp Mountain Games products. And thanks for watching. And what I would say is, whether you're going to be going out with a phaser or you're going to be casting a magic missile, boldly go.